Alrighty, hello every folks, and good morning. Welcome to the community conspiracy and headcanon iceberg. For those that have never seen an iceberg, basically the idea is that we have a big old picture of an iceberg, and as we go further and further down the iceberg, we run into more and more obscure and out there theories as far as whatever the thing happens to be. So today we are going to be going down the list for all of the different bits and pieces for the Ogre series. Now, this can potentially stretch in a lot of different ways. Like, to me personally, the Ogre series is not just the Ogre games. That we have Ogre Battle 1 and 2, we have Tactics Ogre of the SNES, PSP, and Reborn varieties, and then we have things like Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Advance, Advance 2, as well as Vagrant Story. And the way that all of these are connected, surprisingly, is going to be covered by the end of this whole thing, because they are kind of connected by canon, and my favorite headcanon is the Roderick time loop. So we're gonna go ahead and get into this whole thing here because this is a lot of fun. So I had a lot of folks go and submit stuff that they personally like to believe in, whatever else. I got most of them on there. There were a few cases where stuff was kind of combined or whatnot. So we're gonna try to cover all of those, and yeah. Let's go ahead and get started. So first off, with the sky layer, we're going to have the mostly innocent stuff. This is the stuff that's just kind of generally accepted at this point. The stuff that's not terribly contentious or what have you. So first and foremost, Denim and Olivia bonking on a boat. What's that about? So this was actually something that was a bit of a community headcanon thing for a good number of years, since at the end of the game, it's shown that Olivia goes to go find Denim, and that's kind of about it. Now, that would have been the end of that, and there was actually a little gif that was circling around for a little bit of a while of Denim and Olivia holding hands, and, they go on their little date over the course of the story. It's all cute and whatnot, but what's funny is that one of the first tweets that came out once Reborn was official was Matsuno basically saying, yeah, no, they were totally doing it on that boat in the credits, just so you know. So, just kind of one of those funny little tidbits there. All right, next up on the list is going to be Vice's motivations. So, in terms of Vice, there's a lot of theories over, whether he was trying to accomplish one goal or the other. And this, so my personal favorite headcanon, and one that I found generally a good number of folks seem to agree with, is just that Vice is hormonal. Like, the entire thing can just be explained away. Like, a lot of his other motivations might potentially clash with each other, but everything from his death quotes to where he shows up to who he orders to do what just seems to come across as a edgy teenager that wants to get in Cashua's pants. Like for example, Law Route, when he sends Goosen out to go talk to you, you're not the person he talks to. He doesn't talk to the commander of the army there. He talks to Cashua first and tries to get her to switch sides. In the case of when Gamp, or not Gamp, why am I forgetting his name? Zapan goes to try and kidnap her. One of the first things he does is essentially kill him for touching her in any way. Did I say kill him? Yeah, kill him. Anyway, so he kills off Zapan in that situation. But in basically every situation, he's always either trying to low-key flirt in really awkward ways, or he's trying to send somebody else to go do it for him. So it's just kind of a funny little thing that it's very consistent in that particular way. All right, and the third kind of innocent thing for the sky layer here is going to be the brand name gear. This is kind of a personal headcanon thing. It could be officially part of the design for all I know, but it's a funny thing that if you take a look at all of the stuff that actually comes from the shop, they will generally have a far higher value if you go back to go sell it to the shop. But you sell them objectively better equipment, and they do not care. They simply want no part of it. Oh, that is weird. Hold on. Sorry, just a sec here. What the hell is that about? Huh. Okay, there we go. Problem solved. So, apparently, it wasn't quite the rolling power outages as much as the Steam Deck not being plugged in. That's... Well, you know what? To its credit, it's managed to last about 7 hours, so good for it. Anyway, so... let's go ahead and continue on here. Okay. Yeah, the brand name gear there, you'll notice that the fancy schmancy stuff that you get from Palace of the Dead or Sam Bronze or whatever else, the straight up legendary equipment, unique items, whatever else, they sell for absolute absolute peanuts. But the stuff that's actually from the store that's objectively way worse, well, it has their brand name, so obviously it's going to sell for a little bit more. Now, sure, that's kind of, game design 101, but also at the same time, I like to think that they just have their brand names on there. Okay, so that said, let's go ahead and continue on here to the next one. If it'll let me. There we go. Now it's going. Sorry, it's a little bit of a scuffy setup here. I tried to kind of just use one picture to cover up another picture, and now we're just going to awkwardly scroll up. So, yeah. Okay, next we get to the top of the iceberg layer. This is going to be close to the ocean, but we're not quite going deep just yet. So next on the list is going to be the Rudlum is Albaleo thing, and this is all but confirmed. So for those that have never heard of Albaleo, don't worry, you didn't miss some major plot point. He is a character that is about the sidest of characters that you could possibly run into. He's that guy that's over there as a picture on the right. You see, before the events of March of the Black Queen, there was essentially a fight between a guy that was trying to set up an army of dragons. And he's essentially a body snatcher that Rashidi hires to go and get him this army of dragons. And he's killed off in a bit of a side story there. If you ever actually wanted to play that chapter, it is a single fight that is hidden in the story. You start off any March of the Black Queen game with the name Fire Seal, and then you can go fight Albaleo and his army. And granted, your team is freakishly overpowered. It is not difficult whatsoever. Like, yeah, let's just go ahead and start you off with princesses. I wonder how hard this will be. So yeah, the funny part is, he is kind of made out to be absolutely awful at his job, because every time that he pops up, he tries to do the same thing again, only to immediately get curb stomped. And when we find Rudlum over in Let Us Cling Together there, he's essentially looking for the secrets of the Dragon Lords there, hiding in Palace of the Dead. Having accidentally reincarnated, more or less, at the entrance to POTD, and just kind of figuring he could go solo the thing. So, he's pretty much dead if you don't go and recruit him, but the funny part is that he'll go ahead and stick to your party after that if you go ahead and save him. So, essentially, you have a spy in your midst that entire time. Now, the way that he pops up, the way that he talks, the class that he is, and whatever else, it seems to be heavily implied that he is almost definitely the same guy. That he is one of a few body snatchers in this universe. So we'll get some more on that in a little bit of a moment. But Albaleo / Rudlum are able to reincarnate. That every time they die, they essentially pop up with some vague idea of what they're supposed to be doing, and then they just sort of try to do it. Other than that, it's a little bit unclear, but that's more or less what his deal is. Alright, next up is Gildora's Racist Manifesto. So, okay. This is one that got submitted 4 times, which is hilarious to me, but it's kind of assumed that Gildora must have a racist manifesto somewhere. Every time you talk to her, she is effectively going on and on and on over how much she hates the Wallister, they're the lesser people, whatever else, and she's from a place that happens to have a fairly large kind of, scholarly community and what have you. She tends to be someone that is implied to have a lot of writings off in the background, and she's fairly high-ranking. But again, most of the stuff that she writes, most of the stuff that people know her for, is just being extremely kind of derogatory towards the Wallister and anybody that's not a Galgastani. So, due to the fact that she's mentioned to have written books before, it's assumed that she basically wrote the in-universe equivalent of Mein Kampf for the Galgastani there. That was, I believe, one of the direct quotes that somebody asked to put in here. So yeah, don't feel too bad about completely curb stomping her on the bridge. Alright, next up, Karitanai probably smells bad. So Karitanai is where a hell of a lot of executions are held, and when we later see some of those executions, they seem to be being held in the courtyard of the castle itself. Now, they mention that they do this on a very regular basis, so that place probably absolutely reeks. So there we go. That's a nice happy tip of the iceberg, right? Just nice little happy innocent things to go on to. So now let's go ahead and get to the ocean layer. So this is when stuff starts to get a little bit deeper and weirder and whatever else. So, okay. First of all, Alphonse, bad end or bad end? So, in the case of Alphonse, for those that didn't know, Alphonse is effectively Lancelot Tartaros from Tactics Ogre. That is to say, the one Tactics Ogre is to the other Tactics Ogre. So, the main character of the GBA game is your not quite necessarily bad guy in your later Tactics Ogre, right? So this part is pretty well known, and I'm not going to label it as spoilers because that particular situation can actually play out in a number of different ways, and one of those things is arguably the happiest ending that the series ever has. And that's why I'm saying bad end or bad end, because what Knight of Lotus kind of put on the table here is that literally the entire lore of the series, the entire universe here, essentially hinged on whether or not Tartaros got laid. So for those that never played it, essentially at the start of the game, he is saved by a sister at a church that goes by the name of Eleanor, and in more or less he's like a confused kid at that time. He's more or less he's basically a fresh recruit, though he's treated as a sort of sub-commander sort. And he has his own small team that he leads, but essentially at every decision of the game, he decides to go back and make another visit to the church. He's like, you know what? Maybe I should just go discuss it with this lady. She seems to know what's going on. My commander guy is being kind of sketchy. Maybe I should just get her advice on this. And more often than not, she ends up leading him in the right direction. So ultimately, who he decides to kind of believe in and follow and whatever else, ultimately decides whether or not any of his other kind of commanding sorts end up surviving. His actual commander and and that guy's kind of second in command there can just end up joining your team over the course of the game, or for example, the representative of the church and her spy might join you instead. And whichever ones join you, the other ones end up dead. However, when it comes to Eleanor, she's always going to be on your team, but what she decides to do over the course of the game is dependent entirely on whether or not you've trusted her at different points of the game there. So if, for example, the two of them have a more or less healthy relationship figured out, she ends up leaving her abusive kind of priest guy at the church there, and ends up following him into the army there. He stops to go kind of take her concerns into consideration and whatever else, and multiple times in the story. The kind of canon route of the whole thing is that he ends up siding with his commander there. He ends up potentially putting aside the church for the time being. Or actually, it's okay. So it's a little bit unclear there, but either way, one of those two ends up surviving. I personally believe that Richter and Orson end up potentially surviving in that potential. Okie dokie. One quick little break to friggin' choke as you do. Okay, so slight correction. So essentially, the canon route is more or less that he decides to go side with the church. He ends up accidentally killing his commander. His second in command there ends up kind of forced to be killed in a delaying action, and ultimately once he ends up fighting Shaher, who's basically in-universe Lucifer here, he basically says that he's taking somebody with him, and he goes to grab someone. And in that particular situation, essentially Eleanor will step in and say, hey, it's cool, it's fine, I'm just going to go sacrifice myself in this situation, just don't take him. So she decides to be all extra unreasonably smitten and essentially gets taken by the Antichrist, at which point our dude is in a pretty precarious position, that he ends up finding himself in a case where his commander died. He is essentially, that guy's death is on him at this point. The entire place has more or less accidentally gained autonomy, and that's not really what his goal here was. Everyone thinks that he's responsible for all this stuff, and so he essentially can't go back to his home. He can't go back to Lotus, and so he more or less has to go side with the church. But in order to get with the church, he has to have bribes. So he ends up handing over the Holy Lance over to the church there. He ends up going and joining them, gets a name change, at which point eventually that leads to all of the kind of overthrow of the Lotus government and whatnot, and eventually leads us to the sort of canon route there. However, on the flip side, the B route is objectively the happiest ending for basically the entire series right then and there. So instead, The church lady and her spy end up sacrificing themselves in order to kind of fend off the demon there, as it were. He ends up saving Richter and Orson, and all of them end up potentially, yes, well, actually not potentially. They end up saving Ivana there as well. She'll be important later. And then a lot of them end up going and killing Shaher, and the spy lady ends up being the one that gets snatched in that particular case. That she decides to go, try and kill him in his afterlife situation or something. And it also turns out that Eleanor there was actually her sister. That's really the main reason that she was there, not necessarily the church as much as family or something. Anyway, the kind of happy outcome of all of this is we got Ivana and Richter. So Richter's there representing Lotus, Orson's there as his bodyguard, Ivana's there as a representative of the island and also related to the family that runs the island now. Now that all the other leadership is dead, the two of them essentially now end up running the island. They have official support from Lotus. They've created a new happy outpost where everybody's getting along. Everybody got what they wanted. They have peace with the mermaids on the other end of the island, courtesy of Eleanor there. And essentially, at that point, Mr. Tardy has no reason to go anywhere. So essentially, he and Eleanor just retire to go do it in the woods, more or less. Literally, the last scene that we see is that they're just going and traveling on some mountains and just off on a picnic, basically. At which point, yeah, he just retires. He's done. Like, he has no reason to continue on with his career. He's got himself a nice position on this island. He's there supposedly helping Richter or whatnot. And they mention, like, yeah, the dude's never seen in Lotus again. Like, the Lotus thing never ends up happening. They end up never getting overthrown. We don't actually know how corrupt they potentially were, but I like to think that it was more of a case of what happened in a certain January a few years ago where folks just kind of assumed a bunch of things and kind of got misled into overthrowing or attempting an overthrow that they didn't really understand. So I'm going to assume it was something like that. So it's objectively like the nicest ending in the whole thing. The Valeria stuff, it ends up potentially playing out a decent bit differently. In that particular case, the Bakram never end up getting the support they have. The place is still more or less a little bit fractured there. And presumably it still ends up being a little bit of a stalemate. So who knows? The Wallster might have potentially pulled it back at that point, since Lotus never gets involved. But one way or the other, the whole Lotus situation ends up being a lot cleaner. Presumably Zenobia never happens, because nobody's worried about them invading, because they're not quite switching into their whole empire mode as of yet. So, all in all, it just seems like everything would have been ending happily right then and there. So that's fun. All right, next up, the Heaven's Gate is in San Bronza. So, the end of Night of Lotus, there's a specific church that you run into. Well, it's kind of like a flying temple thing. There is also a building at the end of San Bronza that was added in the PSP version and made it again in Reborn. It just happens to look really, really similar to that same place, so I like to think Heaven's Gate just sort of landed on top of San Bronza or something. It's weird that it's up there. They do mention that it was specifically a city that was blown up into the sky, and most of these games have had a floating city of some variety, but I like to think at some point they just sort of collided and they happen to be the same place. Like, who knows? Night of Lotus happens a good bit before, so maybe it crashed into whatever that city was, and/or it was just kind of flying by at the time, and then just San Bronza gets blown up and conveniently happens to wind up in the same gravity well. I don't know, but either way, that building looks very, very similar. So that's, I think it's like 2 maps before the end of San Bronza proper, if you're wondering which one it is. Anyway, okay, so next, body snatchers are real. So this is confirmed. We know this for sure. Deneb is a body snatcher. Albaleo is a body snatcher. King Agar, well, not King. Prince Agars is not necessarily. I don't know if body snatchers is the right term. Because some of them come back as themselves. Some of them come back as different people. Like, it seems. Like, when it comes to Albaleo, it's probably worth mentioning, he actually was meant to come back for the finale of Ogre Battle. Because after he presumably instantly dies in Let Us Cling Together there, he actually reincarnates as a baby, specifically King Tristan's baby, back in Zenobia, at which point, just being born causes a whole multitude of issues that end up spiraling into the royal family getting killed. Any particular ways, though, this means that reincarnation slash body snatchers are a real thing in this universe that can just sort of happen at any given time. It is very infrequently explored, and we don't know what the mechanics of it are, but we do know that Deneb just kind of keeps coming back a little bit younger every time. So yeah, Deneb presumably, despite the fact that they say that she joined the Zenobian army in Ogre battle, could just as easily have been killed by them and then just joined anyway at some later time. So yeah, that's a thing. Anyways, so we should probably switch the music to something a bit more subaquatic at this point. It's looking a bit more right. So next we get to the lower half of the iceberg here. Okay. So this is one that's going to bring in a few more aspects from a few other games that we haven't quite touched on yet. So first of all, Lotus actually potentially has good intentions over the course of most of this, like Lotus in general. Obviously, there's several corrupt elements here and there, but in general, they do still seem to be a country that thinks it's doing the right thing whenever it's going and, doing its empire-type stuff. Here's the thing, though. It's unclear exactly who runs it. Like, original Lotus seemed to be more of a bureaucratic place that was more or less just trying to kind of run their day-to-day. Once they have their whole religious takeover situation, at that point, the church seems to be doing a thing kind of similar to the Brotherhood of Steel from Fallout, where they seem to be collecting all of the random kind of artifacts here and there, preparing for this second Ogre battle situation. They don't know when or how it's going to happen, they just know that it's going to happen somehow. That they believe all these different prophecies and whatnot, and they're more or less stockpiling all of these super weapons. However, once they end up actually getting their whole government switch situation happening, that's when all of those types of weapons end up getting turned against various places here and there. Whether it's the fancy weapons that the Knight Commanders carry, whether it's things like the Zodiac Stones that we see used in Ogre Battle 64, and that's actually the other thing that's probably worth mentioning here that kind of deserved its own entry, that the Zodiac Stones did not start in Final Fantasy Tactics. There's actually a lot of interesting running threads between all these games. The Zodiac Stones actually started in March of the Black Queen, and then they ended up getting used as a direct plot point to turn people into ogres in Ogre Battle 64, and then they just sort of disappeared for a while and came back in FFT. So it's interesting that they might have good intentions kind of deep down. They're just kind of corrupted by the leadership that took over. That it seemed like their goal was more or less to prepare for this second Ogre battle, but eventually it ended up getting turned against them. So either way, I like to think of it as, when they mentioned that Ogre 8 was supposed to involve Lotus becoming the good guys again, it would, presumably would have come full circle. And they do mention, in those notes that you were supposed to start as a new recruit from Lotus, but I got the feeling, and this isn't really necessarily based on anything, just kind of personal headcanon, that originally Knight of Lotus was taking that particular idea and misreading it for the wrong game, that maybe you were supposed to originally be some different variant that was something similar to Alphonse, and then they just kind of reused that idea for Knight of Lotus, which might have been why Mitsuno seemed pretty pissed that the game existed in the first place. But in that particular case, we do see Tardy going and leaving no matter what. Canonically, he cannot be killed in any way. He's one of the few characters that cannot be killed in any way at the end of Lucht. So there's a pretty solid chance that he was meant to be the protagonist of Ogre 8, and that's kind of my my headcanon on that one, that he was supposed to be the final good guy of the series. It's like finally coming full circle after everything that happened, which would be a really nice character moment there, in my opinion. But yeah, in general, it seems like their primary goal was to prevent the end of the world, not necessarily to actually go and take over until, that takeover happened. Okay, next, Orlando in Tactics Ogre. So this primarily sticks out because there's nobody else named Orlando in the series, in the Ogre side of the series anyway. So obviously we have Orlando Cid in Final Fantasy Tactics, and he's, a guy that's got some prestige behind him. But there's also similarly a commander sort that's killed during the kind of introductory portions of the game there, named Orlando, who actually fights in the whole Roderick and Dorgalloa war. And in that particular case, we get a small snippet saying that this Orlando guy was killed defending one of the castles, I believe on Roderick's side. So Did I say Roderick earlier? I might have misspoke earlier. Sorry if I did. It was supposed to be Roderick and Dorgy. Anyway, so we just see that this is, a guy that's more or less left in charge of defending a castle, and he ends up dying, but the name sticks out because it's, again, the weird spelling that's used for Orlando Cid in Final Fantasy Tactics. So, is it an alternate universe type of situation? Is it a reshuffle of the universe? I don't know. Maybe we'll be revisiting that idea as we carry on. All right, next we've got Branton killed Dorgy, and this is, I guess this might be a little bit too low on the list, to be fair. This one's very heavily implied that it seems like Branton was presumably the trusted confidant that went down with Dorgalawa, that just sort of closed the door behind him and turned him into an ogre there. So presumably that's what happened. I like to think it makes sense. He does seem the sketchy sort, and he does seem to be aware of what the Hell's Gate looks like. Since he is having nightmares about it. And again, he doesn't recognize the guy. He has one nightmare that basically is just him getting screamed at by Dorgy, and he's just like, yeah, I don't know what the hell you're saying, man, that dream sucked. So, so either way, there's that. All right, and now we go a little bit deeper to the bottom end of the iceberg here. So first off, Tartaros did nothing wrong. Now, obviously, this one's a play on something way worse, but the general idea behind this theory is that if you think about it, Tardy in general, while he does do a lot of very misguided stuff, he does have a tendency to actually be more or less acting in the interest of peacekeeping throughout most of the story events. More of anytime he's involved in the story, it essentially could be seen in a positive way as him actually trying to do the mission that they set out to do there. So, for example, at the very start of Lucht, it could be seen that he is actually trying to end the war before it starts by going and essentially kidnapping Kashua and putting her on the throne before anything else happens. When they're losing is the only time that he actually has a thought of, well, it might potentially be easier to come back and take over the place and, kind of deal with their sort of plan D, as it were, if he were to kill her off then and there, so that they can't actually unite, against him, so to speak. So we're talking about a case where his plan A seems to more or less be to put Kashua on the throne and just kind of essentially use whatever information is gained to figure out if they can control the Chaos Gates or not, and then just more or less kind of have the place as a sort of vassal kingdom, so to speak. Essentially switch their alliance over to the Wallister instead of the Bakram there, which they actually do plan to do partway through the story, and that's actually one of the big tragedies of the neutral route, that the Lodicians actually do try to switch sides to essentially abandon the Bakram in favor of the Wallister, but at that point Ronway is feeling too confident and tries to have him killed instead. So essentially, it could be seen that their plan all along was more or less, as soon as they realized kind of what their situation was just to leave somebody in charge, kind of try to find some member of the royal family that's still alive, and try to kind of peacefully take over the place. Not completely peacefully, but mostly peacefully. Now, that does lead to the question of why exactly did they burn down Goliath? That wasn't really his call. Like, granted, he does seem asleep at the wheel in that particular situation. But in that particular case, that was Balzaphon, and that dude is always doing sketchy stuff at all times. Now, that said, we don't know for sure what the kind of background situation of this was, and I would assume it would have been explained in Ogre 8 if he was the main protagonist. The reason that I say this is because it's one of those situations that seems like it was meant to be fleshed out in more detail. Because we do get some information of it in Coda 4, sorry. Now, for those that never made it that far, basically what ends up happening is that they're redoing the intro of the game there. They're just kind of up there at the top of Goliath, and he says, okay, look, we're just going to go search through all these houses. We're trying to find this one guy. He has the information we need. Just kind of in, out, 20-minute adventure, no problem. At which point, Balzaphon's like, no, that's going to take too long. I got lunch waiting at home, and decides to go set fire to the town instead. Anyway, in that particular situation, though, we see that Tardy doesn't seem to do much. He seems to be pretty checked out at that point. But why is that? Because he actually just got back with the same team from a different raid that they had done earlier, where they had just gone and stolen the Brynhilder from Zenobia. Now, it's a personal headcanon on this, I think the dude just had PTSD at that point. That he wasn't sure why they were doing what they were doing, that they needed to control these chaos gates there, and he was seeing something similar to what he saw when he was on an island for the first time when he was younger. So when, for example, he just lost his eye, potentially just he was still having perception issues, maybe he was still being distracted, because bear in mind, this was like, I think it was like a week or something prior to this, they had stolen that sword, but he lost his eye, so he very clearly could have been completely out of it at that point. In fact, if they had decided for the Reborn version to debuff the ever-loving hell out of this guy, it would have made a ton of sense, because, again, dude just lost his eye, his perception must suck. It would take a while to actually get used to something like that. So I personally kind of have this headcanon thing that they were more or less distracted by their new injury, and they were kind of letting Balzaphon take the reins for a little bit. But again, that's kind of where the theory goes on that one. That's he was distracted or checked out for some reason, and that's why Balzaphon gets to kind of call the shots there, despite being more or less the second in command. And or he might have just lost a lot of political clout for, potentially getting injured on the job or something. Who knows? It's unclear. He also might still have been a little bit of a pariah, considering that when he went back to Lotus the first time, he was considered a traitor. So maybe he was still working his way up, and he couldn't afford making a wrong call. Maybe they had a talk beforehand where he's like, okay, look, you're technically in charge. I'm just kind of here leading this thing. Kind of plausible deniability, as it were. It's unclear. But either way, that's how I like to think about it. Alright, next, the Dagar Mountains connection. So, okay, going back to the whole, FFT and Tactics Ogre might potentially be more linked than you think. We have the Dagar Mountains that are in Final Fantasy Tactics. Very kind of random location. You pass through there once or twice. But that's the thing, though. It had two different spellings in different versions of the game. We had the old Dolgar, and we had Dulgur or something like that for War of the Lions. But it's interesting how both different spellings happen to just use different letters of Dorgala's name. Is there a connection? I don't know, but I'm just saying, I like to think that that's where they mined all of the random bullcrap that they used to go make the Hanging Gardens, It had to come from somewhere. Would it have been a lot more convenient to not say all that stuff from another island? Maybe. But I like to think that that's what happened there, that there's a bit more of a connection than we think. All right, next up on the list, Nybeth was right. So this is a super weird one, because if you think about it, Nybeth's whole thing is discovering immortality, preventing death, and allowing everybody to just kind of, live forever, as it were. Essentially, just using zombies to sort out their wars, that they never have to worry about dying, they never have to worry about losing the people they love and whatnot. And sure, he goes about it in a lot of pretty nefarious ways, but think about it for a second. Like, the guy doesn't typically go out of his way to militarize his army that often. We do see a couple of cases where he does, for example, follow orders on the Galgastani side to go provide zombies for their teams, but he doesn't typically go and do attacks by himself. His only concern is his research. We see that everybody's disgusted by him and the stuff that he does, but technically he's using bodies that were already dead. He's not creating them himself. And while he does do a lot of experiments on them, they do seem to actually be following that goal of trying to achieve immortality there. And if you think about it, he does. He does have those zombies, he does have some successes that he ends up bringing back to life. Some less so than others, some more so than others. But eventually, by the end of it, he is essentially an immortal lich, so he achieved that for himself. He has several people in Palace of the Dead that are effectively also more or less immortal, and he does create a lot of creations that are otherwise impossible. Like, for example, that water, I think it was like a water ice dragon or something, or a water earth dragon or something that he comes out with in Reborn. I did forget to include that in the unique units thing. Alright, sorry, needed a quick drink of coffee there. We do see what happens with, what's-his-face, Divold there, who again, technically comes back to life. He comes back sentient, he comes back messed up and a weird husk, but he is back. We see partial successes with Vice and Leonor and and what's his face, Gildas. So he's on the right track. One way or another, he's essentially taking people that have already expired by one means or another, and is trying to achieve something that would potentially benefit a society that is having constant wars in a pretty useful manner. A lot of his students are doing sketchy stuff, like we see a lot of his acolytes and stuff going and sending armies against Almorica or whatnot. And the one time that he ends up showing up there himself, he seems to be doing so more so for trying to kind of catch his daughter, more so than actually to go attack Almorica itself. That does seem to be Diebold's plan, I think, or Zombie Diebold's plan. So again, it's not that he ends up completely perfectly achieving everything, but he is on the right track. So there's a pretty decent chance that he was actually right the whole time. So there's that. All right, let's move on. Tip of the iceberg. All right. So we've got, first of all, we're going to start with Lizard Man Heaven. So this is a very kind of a common community meme of the Ogre series, but it's weird that lizard men are, for whatever reason, always associated with heaven. This is never quite explained, because they always mention that, oh, here's these lizard men that are constantly being abused by every nation around. They're always finding themselves working as mercenaries or in demeaning positions or what have you. But in the case of Lizard Man Heaven, it can't help but, like, you can't really help but notice that while there are other variants of other things, including, for example, heavenly octopi, which is just interesting, but we can't help but notice that there's an absolute ton of golden lizards up there in heaven, like, all the frickin' time. It's every time that there's a depiction of stuff up there, it happens to, for whatever reason, include lizards. Don't know why. Apparently they're holy or something. Being that cold-blooded apparently makes you good at operating in the sky or something. I don't know. But either way, for some reason, lizard men come from heaven. Don't question it. It's fine. This is just normal stuff. But this gets us to our second one, which is that Fogel, over from March of the Black Queen, is a lizard man. Now, his official story is that he was one of the three heroes that was sent out to go stop the initial ogre battle. That he essentially fought and killed everything his way to the boss there. And then once all was said and done, he was the strongest guy on Earth. And he needed more shit to kill. So essentially he just went on his Dark Souls journey and started just fighting and killing anything that he could, fighting the biggest stuff that he could find, until eventually he finds a divine dragon, at which point he goes and he kills that dragon, but the locals kept telling him, like, look, this thing is cursed or something, just, you can't go, you can't fight this thing. You can't go fight the divine dragon, right? So he ends up fighting the thing for weeks straight, and at the end, it dies. And essentially the city with all of the locals gets torn in half. Just gets completely torn to pieces. Now, I want to mention this specifically, because this is one of two times that we get to actually have a Highlander reference in here. Because one of the rules of the Highlander universe is that they can never fight on holy ground, and in this case he was essentially fighting a holy dragon in its home. And immediately, the place ended up getting torn in half, just like the Highlander series where they end up fighting in a temple and then Pompeii happens. Is it a direct reference? I don't know, but I like to think it is. Anyway, so as it happens, at that point, he is, aside from accidentally killing all of the locals that he was supposed to be protecting, he ends up being cursed to forever walk with a dragon head. Now, that being said, that's quite an impressive story for a guy that claims to be the strongest that's ever been. Good for him for outfiddling the devil and all that, but as far as all of that goes, what if he was just a lizard man the whole time, and he just really needed an elaborate backstory to be accepted as a lizard man? This is something that Vale was pointing out, and it's definitely a lot more believable than his story of, I was the coolest guy ever and beat everything forever, and all I got was this cool lizard head out of it. So, it's just a little bit of an idea there. Okay, and then moving on from there, actually, I believe the term she was using was that they're an official Fogel truther. Okay, and then next up on the list is going to be the Deneb and Canopus ship. So this one comes up a lot because you see a lot of banter between Deneb and Canopus. They always pretend to hate each other. He calls her a leather handbag, she calls him cantaloupe, but one way or another, you can't help but feel like there's a sexual tension in the air, and somebody wants to try to make that happen. So, maybe that's a little bit of a thing. Maybe, Maybe it's just more of a case of they definitely want to do something, but she's afraid of that insanely high dex score, and he's afraid of being turned into a stuffed turkey. But we don't know for sure. We may never know. But if there is an Ogre 8, it would be interesting to see those two paired up for absolutely no reason. All right. So next up, we start getting into the true underwater layers. So the first one for our underwater layer, did Divine actually prevail? So this is an odd glitch that I like to think is potentially a feature, because frankly, a lot of the glitches that we've discovered did end up turning up being features. So recently there was a whole discussion on the Vision Discord there, wherein it was a combination of, I believe it was Gibbed Rakes and... why am I blanking on the name right now? Recession there, that were all going and testing the different prevailing element mechanics, and while they mention that the prevailing element is going to be one element or another, there is only one that ever actually ends up getting any effect, and that's Divine. That is to say, Divine gets its direct benefit, but it also is a reverse benefit for the dark element as well in certain situations for whatever frickin' reason. Now this is... yeah, sure, technically it's probably a bug and they just never really bothered completely fixing it, but the interesting thing is, what if we consider this more from a lore perspective? Because in this particular case, this means that we potentially have a case where Divine actually did win in the end, as they said from all of the kind of background lore stuff, that all of the other elements would be getting a bonus right now, but unfortunately, they've already left. Guess what didn't leave, though? Guess what's the one with the main prevailing religion that's around? Maybe Divine actually ended up winning that war after all, and that's the only sign of it that's left. Who knows? Spooky. Okay, next, the Palace of the Dead has its own culture, and this is a fun thing that we saw a lot of in Tactics Ogre Reborn. So if you go down into the Palace of the Dead, you'll notice that they actually have distinct names for all of the blues. So all the blue units that are detailed to have been units that have gone completely crazy with the absolute malicious intent down there, and essentially just live their lives in permanent murder mode, their names are all different. They have a very distinct series of names from anywhere else in the game. In fact, the Heaven units technically also have this going on their side as well. But yeah, the Palace of the Dead has its own culture. They never share it much with you, but it's interesting how its culture develops more and more as the series progresses. Because you'll notice it's still just kind of normal names when it's just the Deep Dungeon in FFT. We still just have normal names when it's the random units in SNES, and we see that they still mostly have normal names in PSP, though it's interesting that at that point, the old finishers, back from Palace of the Dead, ended up suddenly finding their way onto the surface. It's like Roderick was connected to all that or something. So yeah, suddenly it's interesting how those finishing moves that only he had suddenly become common knowledge. And all of a sudden, once the universe is reshuffled again, they have their own culture down there, they have their own names. I wonder if we'll be revisiting this topic. Alrighty, and now we start to go a little deeper. So next, it's worth noting that it seems implied that Warren has visited San Bronza before. It's unclear how he knew, and presumably he was going and interviewing things like the not quite Pope guy. Maybe he found his way up there, maybe they explored a little bit, maybe the Zenobians were up and doing a little bit of spelunking beforehand, maybe the Walsers gave them a little bit of an away expedition, but it's interesting that Warren seems to have visited San Bronza at some point. See, the thing is, he uses draconic spells over the course of the story. It's not something that he comes equipped with, but it is something that he's capable of using, and also just something that he knows. The warping ability is something that very few characters in the series have access to, and he just kind of has it. Now, that is to say, this could be interpreted a couple of different ways. He has been around a while, and potentially, maybe back when they were presumably a bit more open and available, like when we saw those spells just kind of available at the shop back in Night of Lotus, maybe he picked it up back then, maybe they're a bit more available in Zenobia. We don't know for sure, because technically we also see those warp items available in Zenobia as well. Did he just use one of those, or did he actually end up getting those same draconic spells from San Bronza? Technically, San Bronza didn't exist yet when he first uses it, so it could just be one of the warp items from March of the Black Queen. But I like to think at some point he just quietly snuck away. Presumably they gave him his own team or something, and he just kind of happened to make his way up there somehow. See, there's a bit of a theory that came from Warren Report here, that Warren might potentially be the most powerful character in the series. He's just really low-key about it, because the guy does seem to have access to Draconics long before you could ever even hope to make it up there. He does seem to have the means of closing those gates without the Brynhilder. What was his point? What was his plan for opening or closing the Hellgate without the Brynhilder? How is that even possible? We don't know. And that's the thing. It's presumably one of the only tools capable of doing so, because that's what was needed back in March of the Black Queen, but he keeps insisting that no, it was something that he was just fine handling on his own. He lost track of time a little bit, but he still somehow had a plan for opening and closing the Chaos Gate on his own. It's unclear how, but it does seem to be implied that he actually is way more powerful than he's letting on, and it really would be nice if he at least showed some of that before accidentally almost ending the world in Coda 3, or I guess technically end of Coda 2, argue and comments on that, but either way, it seems to be implied that he is way stronger than he actually is. Okay. Additionally, we have an interesting little note on Azelston, and I mentioned that this is one of 2 times that we'd be able to talk about Highlander today. So, Azelston, he is shown to fight through Pirate's Graveyard a few times. He mentions that he's been through there multiple times. Now, I will say this, though. Whenever we see that we personally fight through Pirate's Graveyard, we have a particular route that we take through the whole place, taking a lot of very direct fights, taking on an absolute ton of enemies, and then we get to a little pool of water that happens to kind of swish in from the coast, and then just happens to have a little stairway right to the very ending that we know that he has been to multiple times. He mentions that he went there in a depressed state, that he's been that way multiple times, and that effectively he had quit his sailing career at that time. What's interesting is one of the other rules of the Highlander universe, and you might be wondering, wait, why am I referencing Highlander so much? It's because he is directly modeled after the kind of mentor character from Highlander. Seriously, he looks exactly like Sean Connery's guy. Go look it up. It is ridiculous. Anyway, though, so we see that he actually, he just seems to get there with little trouble. The only time that he actually tries to directly fight through there is when we end up saving him later on down the line, and he seems more interested in saving Denim. Again, he seems to have implied to have gone in there first, like long before you went there, more than a day before you went there, and yet he comes up behind you. How is that possible? So I have a theory that he actually is following one of the other rules of Highlander there, in which he doesn't need to breathe, and that he simply swam from the bottom of the ocean. He just simply walked right from his shipwreck over to that little pool of water that we see swishing in from the coast, and then he ended up going and marching his way on up there to the actual coast, and that was his way in and out of the place. I think that makes a perfect amount of sense, and yeah, he does technically die of disease at the end, but also, we don't know for sure that he actually does die. We don't directly see him do it. They can actually essentially be killed and brought back to life, with that whole Highlander situation. So if he is one of those immortal type characters, he could just die and come back. I know we've saved him across multiple timelines on multiple playthroughs that I've done, so, who knows? He might just decide to pop on back. He doesn't exactly want to have anyone question where he might be from. I'm just saying, dude looks pretty immortal to me, and he does seem to have a lot of experience for somebody that's supposedly was on a boat. He does seem to be capable of outfighting anybody else that's around. Weird how that works. Anyway, let's go ahead and then continue on. Going back to old Roddy there. So this is one of those things I was touching on earlier, when it comes to the Palace of the Dead's growing influence. See, as we carry along, we start noticing that it does more and more through the series, right? So, like we already mentioned, that it's weird how Roddy's finishers is kind of proliferated out into the world, right? That it seems like they just suddenly became common knowledge and nobody really questioned it. But then after that, it's interesting how there was just kind of crafting knowledge that was all over the world for all kinds of very specific weapons that would be very useful for somebody looking to build up an army. And it's interesting how they just sort of all conglomerated into a library about 30 floors into Palace of the Dead. They're just kind of all there now. It's interesting how there were, improvements made to a lot of pieces of equipment that now suddenly work better than they used to in the last timeline. I wonder who could be responsible for that. I wonder if it's all related. I don't know. We should probably go a little bit deeper. Alrighty. Next, we have a little bit of an interesting theory. Essentially, one of the theories that connects all of the Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre games here, and that is that Moogles are secretly Aeons with guns. Now, here's what I'm getting at here. We see that Moogles exist and have guns in Tactics Advance and Tactics Advance 2. Presumably, they were a civilization that existed at some point. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. We don't exactly know for sure, but they do mention that they invented them. However, later on down the line, we see in Final Fantasy Tactics that guns were just sort of found. They were an ancient technology that existed, but nobody really knows who invented them, like where they came from, what the deal was. They just sort of are a thing now, right? So they just sort of exist in this particular situation. But we also see that there's something that is essentially back to being common knowledge and more or less somewhat available, somewhat becoming more popular in Tactics Ogre. It's weird how that works. However, then we also see something else, in which Moogles are essentially a summon that's available in FFT. So what if they were essentially went the way of all of the Aeons in Final Fantasy X, where they got turned into Aeons that had invented guns. Their technology remained, their souls became magical bullshit, and now suddenly they're able to keep on living through the most uncomfortable means possible. Is that what's going on here? I don't know. We just gotta ask these questions, you know? So either way, that's a fun little connection theory to have there. Now, in what order this all works, who frickin' knows? Maybe it's we have them being invented by the Balbadians, who secretly are just transforming Moogles the whole time. Maybe they were, cursed into becoming stuffed animals. Maybe they just came first, and then the Moogles took over and stole their guns. How embarrassing would that be to get taken over by the frickin' Moogles? But either way, they were an island nation by themselves, and then bing bang boom. Over time, they became associated with this technology. They became obsessed with all of these other creations that they had. They started living with airships, and then eventually it all came tumbling down. Eventually, it all just crashed down on top of their head as their technology became too much. Until finally, by the time we get to Final Fantasy Tactics, the Moogles are no more than a thing of the past. They're just a magical thingy that you can go ahead and summon because you need to heal people with your stuffed animal thing. And now, after all is said and done, they have come full circle. They've disappeared, but they are ever present. It's a fun theory anyway. Okay, next up, Vagrant Story Reborn. So, we're going to go for a brief synopsis of what happens in Vagrant Story. Essentially, there's a dude that is trying to essentially get rid of the ultimate evil power that he's got accidentally kind of etched into his back. In his particular case, he's trying to find somebody to offload it onto, and there's several people that are trying to capture it. None of this will make any sense until the end of the game, but don't worry about it. Anyway, over the course of this whole thing, main character ends up acquiring said power and just sort of disappears with it. Now, when it comes to Vagrant Story, we see remnants of this stuff that just sort of happen to show up, like the root inverse is how you end up creating angels, implying that the angels themselves are actually a evil construction, just like the angels actually tell us in San Bronza. We're not sure if they're telling the truth, but we know for sure that that particular symbol is supposed to be a sign of evil power, more or less, that allows you to control demons. And it's weird how using that particular item allows somebody to be turned from a demonic unit into an angel, implying that an angel is just essentially a mind-controlled demon of sorts. Maybe, I don't know. We're kind of stretching this, but go with it. But either way, it's weird that it shows up there. Additionally, we actually see weapons from Vagrant Story showing up there as well. Like, you can craft the Fandango, which is the starting weapon that Ashley begins with. And additionally, a lot of the finishers also just happen to share the exact same names as the ones from Vagrant Story, potentially implying that at some point, the Final Fantasy Tactics stuff had happened, Vagrant Story came as a sequel, and what do you know, maybe that's where Dorgy got it in the first place. Maybe Dorgalloa was Ashley Riot the whole time. We don't know for sure, but it's kind of weird that he's down there. So yeah, what if Dorgalloa is originally Ashley Riot? I don't know. I'm just asking some questions here, So let's go ahead and continue on. Man, I love that particular theory. I don't know if it's going to stick, but please do. Anyway, let's go ahead and continue on here. So then we get to the bottom layer, the truly evil layer, the fairy layer. So, we have the last two. We have Deneb starting the final ogre battle, and we have the Roderick time loop. Okay, so Essentially, this one is fairly simple. Deneb always just happens to show up wherever there's conflict. She happens to show up back in Night of Lotus, happens to just sort of start selling super weapons, and happens to happily fund that conflict and get a hell of a lot of money doing so. She happens to show up in the Valerian Isles, once again happens to make a ton of money, happens to once again, start rolling in the riches, and also happens to be collecting a new little army of pumpkin heads while she's at it. She gets herself killed, presumably in Zenobia, but again, just happens to be sitting there collecting a ton of money, collecting artifacts, collecting all of these different things. But I'm just saying, to me, it seems like Deneb was meant to be the dark horse that was there the whole time. Everybody's got their eyes on somebody like Rudlum slash Albaleo coming in and killing off the Zenobian royal family. They've got their eyes on Lotus going and taking over things to presumably stop something that they don't know. They have their eyes on these different ogre armies. But every time that we see those ogre armies, they happen to just sort of create functional democracies whenever they're left alone. So it's weird that nobody's paying attention to Deneb. She just sort of shows up, flashes a smile, and everyone's like, yeah, okay, pretty lady's just doing all right. So my personal theory is that she would essentially just kind of be the dark horse in the back of the series. That finally, nobody knows where the second ogre battle is going to come from. They end up stopping all of the other threats. And there's Deneb on her throne of glass pumpkins, showing up with her army of demons, coming in to finally take on everybody, to finally get revenge for not accepting her reputation loss back in March of the Black Queen. It just seems like she would be the type of person that would try to take over the world because she thinks it's funny. I'm just saying it seems likely that she wants to create a completely headless world, that she just wants to create a world that she absolutely runs everything, that there's no longer a threat to her, that she no longer has to worry about reincarnating because she reincarnates as everyone. It seems possible. It seems likely. I think it's exactly how the series would have ended. But then we get to the final theory, the Roderick time loop theory. So here's my theory on this whole thing that kind of ties this all together. Every time, and we've touched on this a bunch of times here, but every time we see Roderick, he always seems to come back a little bit different. He always seems to have a little bit more influence in the world around him. As I mentioned before, when we see him back in the SNES version, he's just kind of wandering around. You might say a vagrant in Palace of the Dead. He's just sort of there. He has this power that's been given to him. He can share it with the people around him. But throughout the entire time, you can't really do much else with him. He seems to be trying to help you. He doesn't seem to have negative intentions. But you can definitely do a lot of negative things with the skills that he gives you. Then once we see him come back in PSP, we see that now he has a boss fight. He can be fought, and he has essentially a sword that allows him to steal bodies. He has the means to body snatch enemies, and he has the means to achieve unfathomable power through the Ogre set, which he's already collected. He has proper endgame gear. He's one of very few units that actually has that. Well, I mean, he doesn't have a full Ogre set until he comes back in One Vision, but that's not officially canon or whatnot. But still, anyways, general idea is he's got Ogre stuff on him, right? He ends up dropping the Ogre pieces. But still, his finishers have already made it out into the world. How have they made it out into the world if he wasn't there to share them yet? It's almost like he reset the universe, and he did it again. He ended up sharing this information early. He still ended up losing the war, but all of that information is a bit more out there. We'll notice that the Apocrypha spells that he uses, they still achieved their apocalyptic effects, but when somebody went in to collect them after the fact, they were dramatically less powerful in gameplay. It's almost like he went and, sabotaged them so that they couldn't be used against him and whatever armies he decided to come up with. Interesting how that works. After that, he was noticing that wow, man, these longbows are thoroughly kicking my ass. It's weird how I can't even get close to Warren in this particular case to get free. I need to reset everything again. So he goes back again. This time he collects all those crafting books. It's interesting how those crafting books went from an easily accessible location in Farampa Wildwood over to his personal library in Palace of the Dead. Funny how that works. Anyways, so he's down there, he's collected those books, suddenly those longbows will not be a threat to him. Armor technology across the world has now improved. Those longbows are no longer such a major threat to him. Suddenly, all those finishers that he's taught everybody to use are the main way that they're actually going and fighting each other. It's interesting that, again, he has sort of taken over the combat system, as it were. He was potentially having a lot of issues with, casters potentially shutting him down, and it's interesting how they've adopted a policy of no longer using their debuffs on him. That's a very interesting way that things have played out. And again, if we think back on it, we think back on where this guy might have come from. If Roderick was secretly Ashley Riot the entire time, then it all kind of comes full circle. That we originally had all of the Muggles out there in the distance. They ended up destroying themselves with their technology. Their stuff came back in Final Fantasy Tactics, but at that point, a guy that refuses to ever use guns and or pants discovers the ultimate evil technology, just kind of hiding in a weird kind of zombie city that he's been tasked to go figure out. Some guy gets his back ripped off, and at some point that turns into a tattoo for him, at which point he ends up kind of wandering off, wandering into the distance. Nobody knows where he went, or if he decided to go, find a random dungeon on some place called Valeria and just kind of go hang out there. And then at that point, he decided to, just kind of share his knowledge with the people passing by. He wanted to be helpful. He still wanted to help the people around him, but they took it for granted. They ended up going and, potentially getting themselves assassinated at a coronation. That was a complete waste of time. Why was he helping these people? He needs to reset the universe again, so he starts it all again. This time around, they managed to figure out, okay, you know what? This time we see that they don't get themselves assassinated, but what's this? There's some guy that manages to go and get himself laid several decades prior, and now this whole plan's out of motion? No. We set the universe again. We come back on the PSP. Now, all of a sudden, we're in a situation that he's shared all of his knowledge. We're going to help kind of even out the playing field here. We're going to make sure that everybody has this knowledge. You can't abuse this technology or you can't abuse this technique from, one guy if everybody has it. So now everything's an even playing field. But what's this? Even with all of this stuff, suddenly these new weapons that people are making are outclassing the stuff that he's already done. So we reset the universe again. And now finally, everything has been more of an even playing field. Everybody's got an even shot. Does that mean Ashley Riot became Roderick and invented communism through magic? I don't frickin' know. Anyway, so, discuss. I can't believe I have to correct this, because I just noticed I forgot the most important part of the Roderick time loop. The Grand Grimoire. So there's actually an item link between Tactics Advance, between Vagrant Story, between Tactics Ogre, and all of it circles around Roderick. See, the thing is, when it comes to Roderick in particular, in his particular case, he happens to have a particular book that ends up getting dropped in Palace of Dead. Now, this is typically going to come from Blackmore down there, but it's worth noting that the Grand Grimoire is a bit of a recurring thing. See, back in Vagrant Story, the Grand Grimoire is implied to be the tattoo itself. It's implied to be the city of Le Monde. I forget exactly how that goes, because that game's lore confuses me, but it's implied to all essentially be this one thing. Essentially, the Grand Grimoire in mythology is this book that allows somebody to essentially bind and summon demons, but controlling them potentially is a bit more risky. And for some reason, it also includes dating advice, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, so as far as all that stuff goes, the Grand Grimoire is this thing that comes back again in Vagrant Story as this kind of big mythical element, as it were, there in the background, right? And then at the same time, in Tactics Advance, we see that we have Mute that ends up going and finding the Grand Grimoire at a old bookshop. It just sort of presents itself to him in order to create this kind of perfect world for everybody that was there. And it essentially allows him to create the sort of pocket dimension for himself where all of his friends can get their stuff figured out in a place that's really kind of one hell of a hellish dystopia if you think about it. But either way, it presents itself to him, and it actually remains in his possession. While I have seen a lot of wiki articles stating stuff to the contrary, it's still in his possession by the time we get to A2, and it doesn't, in fact, transform the world around them. It transports the person to this kind of pocket dimension thing. At least that's my whole theory on this thing. Now, the thing is, we see that this book is capable of, kind of altering everything around them. It's capable of creating these kind of situations that, either we believe the wiki things and they end up transforming the world, or they essentially allow the person to go and kind of jump into this time bubble here. It could potentially be both, but either way, it has the power to alter the universe in ways like this. But then we see that the book does not originally seemingly appear in Tactics Ogre back on the SNES, but once we come back in PSP, we see that the Grand Grimoire can be gotten later on in Palace of the Dead. At least I don't think you can get the Grand Grimoire back in the original. Correct me if I'm wrong with that. I'm not going to look it up right now. But here's the kind of interesting crux of this whole thing, what ends up changing stuff entirely. We see that there's essentially a book user that happens to be a guy that we save exactly once, who has the ability to stop time in Final Fantasy Tactics, potentially applying that this galaxy stop ability and this ability to just affect the entire world around, aka an astromancer, aka what what we see Warren coming back as is an ability that exists in this universe. So by some means or another, whether it's related or not, this is just a thing that exists for whatever reason. They don't actually explore it, it's just kind of there, you know? But what's interesting is that by the time we get to Tactics Ogre Reborn, there has been a change. You see, the Grand Grimoire is no longer a unique prize that happens to show up at the end of Palace of the Dead. Now there's a bunch of them, and they happen to be spread out and in different, kind of different varieties of disuse. Somebody has collected all of these things that used to be unique and has various different copies of them scattered all over the damn place, almost like, you know, somebody happened to be using a bunch of them. They happen to all be around where Roderick's room is. In my mind, implying that he has essentially been going and using and discarding these things over and over, essentially redoing the universe over and over and over and over and over until he gets it just right to what he's trying to accomplish. Either way, let's go ahead and move on to the actual original ending of this thing, because I completely forgot the most important part. Way to go, brain. That's my crackpot theory for the day. But yeah, that's going to be the conspiracy iceberg here. Yeah, there's a lot of details that are kind of out of place here, but I think it's a lot of fun. So, yeah, discuss in the comments, as it were, and y'all have yourselves a good one. Thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.